The room was heavy with whispers as the family gathered for the will reading. Most came dressed in their finest, dripping with pride and expectation, convinced they would walk away with riches. In the middle of the polished chairs and hushed tones sat a simple woman, dressed plainly, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She had always been overlooked, mocked quietly for her modest clothes, her quiet voice, and the way she never seemed to fit into the grand circle of relatives. To the others, she was nothing more than an afterthought, someone they barely acknowledged. As the lawyer began to speak, the family leaned forward eagerly, ready to hear how the massive fortune of their late relative would be divided. Smiles tugged at lips, eyes flickered with greed, and a few already pictured the life of luxury that would soon be theirs. But when the lawyer glanced up, his eyes pausing for a moment on the woman in the plain dress, the air shifted ever so slightly. He cleared his throat and began to read words that would leave the room silent. At first, the family hardly reacted. They assumed this was routine, that the real treasure would soon be announced in their favor. But the words continued, weaving a story none of them had expected. With each line, the smirks on their faces began to fade. The laughter that once circled the simple woman turned into stares of disbelief. Whispers grew louder, chairs shifted, and tension filled the air as realization set in. By the time the lawyer reached the final sentence, the entire room was stunned. The fortune, every last part of it, had been left to the woman they had spent years mocking. And in that instant, everything they thought they knew was turned upside down. The silence in the room stretched on, broken only by the faint shuffle of papers in the lawyer's hands. No one could believe what they had just heard. The wealthy patriarch, a man known for his strict values and shrewd decisions, had bypassed every polished son, every proud daughter, and every entitled cousin. Instead, he left his fortune to the one relative who had never demanded anything, the quiet, overlooked woman who sat at the edge of the room. Her name was Margaret, though most of them rarely used it. To them, she was simply the plain cousin, the one who never went to fancy parties, never dressed to impress, and never seemed ambitious. She lived in a modest house on the outskirts of town, working simple jobs, often helping neighbors without ever asking for recognition. To the others, she had always been a shadow, someone who didn't matter. But now, that shadow had become the center of every eye in the room. Murmurs of disbelief rippled through the family. Some whispered accusations of a mistake, while others muttered about manipulation. How could the old man, so careful with his wealth, have chosen her? The thought gnawed at them, filling the room with unease. They remembered how she was always quietly present at family gatherings, sitting in corners, offering a kind smile, but never drawing attention. Maybe they had missed something. Maybe the old man had seen something in her that none of them ever cared to notice. The lawyer, steady and unshaken, reminded them that the will was clear and legally binding. Still, the family's eyes burned with questions. Margaret herself sat in silence, her heart racing, unsure whether to feel grateful, afraid, or overwhelmed. What no one yet knew was that this inheritance carried more than just wealth. It carried secrets that would soon shake them all. The liar's words still echoed when the arguing began. A sharp voice broke the silence, accusing Margaret of trickery. Another relative, red-faced with anger, demanded the will be rechecked. The polished sons and daughters, who had always believed the fortune was their birthright, could not accept that everything now belonged to the one they had mocked. The room filled with clashing voices, each person trying to twist the truth to fit their hopes. Margaret, sitting quietly in her plain dress, felt every stare cutting into her. She had never asked for this, never even imagined it. Yet here she was, suddenly the sole heir to a fortune that others had built their entire lives around. Her mind raced back to the old man's last days, his gentle nods in her direction, the quiet conversations he had with her when no one else cared to listen. Maybe he had seen through the greed that consumed the rest. Still, she couldn't understand why he had chosen her, and that mystery weighed heavy on her heart. Some relatives tried to put on calm faces, whispering to one another in corners, plotting their next moves. Others were less subtle, slamming hands on the polished table, demanding explanations. A cousin, once close to Margaret in childhood, avoided her eyes completely, as if betraying her with silence. And in the middle of it all, the lawyer remained firm, repeating that the document was valid, every signature intact. But beneath the anger and disbelief, something else lingered in the room, a quiet fear. They all knew the patriarch never did anything without reason. If he had left everything to Margaret, there had to be more to the story. Each of them wondered what secret truth tied her to the inheritance, and why the old man had trusted only her to carry it forward. The tension inside the room grew so thick it felt hard to breathe. Margaret's hands trembled slightly in her lap, though she kept her face calm. Every glance, every whisper was aimed at her now. The polished cousins leaned together, their eyes darting back and forth, as if plotting their next move. One of them finally stood, his voice rising above the noise, accusing Margaret of keeping secrets, of pretending to be simple all these years while quietly securing the old man's favor. His words struck the room like a spark in dry wood, igniting louder shouts and bitter accusations. The lawyer tried to quiet the storm, but his firm voice was drowned out. Relatives moved closer to Margaret, some with suspicion, others with cold disbelief. She could feel their resentment pressing in, as though the air itself had turned hostile. What none of them realized was that Margaret had as many questions as they did. Why her? Why everything? She remembered moments from her childhood, the times the patriarch had called her into his study while others played in the gardens. He had asked her simple questions about honesty, kindness, and sacrifice. At the time, she thought little of it. Now, those memories pressed against her, carrying a weight she had never understood before. As the lawyer opened a second envelope, the room went still again. His eyes flicked toward Margaret before lowering to the paper, and in that pause, the family's unease turned to dread. They leaned forward, desperate and afraid, sensing that whatever came next would change everything. Margaret's heart pounded as the lawyer cleared his throat. The fortune was only the beginning. Hidden within the will was something else, something the family had not expected at all, and its revelation threatened to shatter the fragile balance already on the edge of breaking. The lawyer's voice cut through the heavy silence as he unfolded the second document. His words carried a weight that made the family lean closer, their anger momentarily swallowed by curiosity. This wasn't just a will, he explained. It was a letter written by the patriarch himself, to be read only after the inheritance was announced. Gasps echoed around the room, the kind of sound that mixes fear with anticipation. Margaret's breath caught in her chest as every eye locked on her again, waiting for the next revelation. The letter began with memories, lines that spoke of family history and choices made long ago. But as the lawyer read on, the tone sharpened. The patriarch revealed that the fortune was more than wealth. It was tied to responsibility. He had seen greed consume the others, their hunger for status outweighing loyalty or compassion. That was why he had chosen Margaret. She was the only one who had never asked for anything, the only one who had shown him kindness without expectation. But then came the twist that sent the room into chaos. The inheritance wasn't hers to simply keep. It was entrusted to her with conditions. The letter hinted at hidden assets, investments, and even properties the family didn't know existed. To claim them fully, Margaret would need to follow a set of instructions left behind by the patriarch. And here was the shock. The instructions required the cooperation of the very family now glaring at her in resentment. A storm of voices erupted, each relative torn between disbelief and fury. Some accused the old man of playing games from the grave. Others began calculating what this could mean for them if Margaret failed. Margaret herself sat frozen, realizing that this fortune was not just a gift, it was a test, one that would force every buried grudge and secret to rise to the surface. The arguments grew louder as the lawyer finished reading, but Margaret finally stood. Her voice was soft at first, yet steady enough to silence the room. She reminded them that the letter was not a trick, but a choice made by the man they all claimed to love. If they truly wanted a share of the fortune, they would need to put aside pride and bitterness to follow the instructions together. For a moment, the family hesitated, torn between greed and resentment. Then, one by one, their anger gave way to uneasy acceptance. The first steps of the patriarch's plan were revealed. Visiting an old estate he had kept hidden, sorting through documents he had locked away, and carrying out charitable acts in his name. Each task forced the family to work alongside Margaret, and though they resisted at first, The truth of their selfishness became harder to deny. They realized the old man had left not only wealth, but also a lesson meant to change them. By the time the final task was completed, the lawyer confirmed that the inheritance now fully belonged to Margaret. The room went quiet again, but this silence felt different. Resentment lingered, yet there was also a grudging respect. They could no longer dismiss her as the plain cousin. She had carried the burden with patience and dignity, proving why she had been chosen. Many left with heavy hearts, knowing they had lost more than money. They had lost the chance to live up to the patriarch's trust. But just as Margaret began to breathe easier, the lawyer handed her one last envelope, addressed only to her. Inside was a single line written in the patriarch's hand. "The greatest treasure is not what I left behind, but what I know you will discover." The fortune was hers, but the true mystery had only just begun. Margaret held the envelope in her hands for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the words her late relative had left only for her. She felt a strange calm wash over her, as though the man's presence lingered in the room even now. While the others had already begun filing out, whispering among themselves, Margaret stayed behind. She realized that the fortune was never meant to be about wealth alone. It was about trust, about values, and about carrying forward something bigger than money. In the days that followed, the family slowly drifted back into their lives. Some avoided her entirely, embarrassed by how they had treated her. Others, perhaps humbled by the old man's lesson, reached out with quiet apologies. Margaret accepted each with grace, though she knew time would reveal who truly meant their words. The hidden estates and investments became hers to manage, but instead of flaunting the wealth, she poured it into causes the patriarch had once spoken about, helping families in need, restoring community spaces, and keeping his legacy alive. For the first time, the family began to see her differently. The woman they once mocked for her plain clothes and quiet ways now stood as the keeper of a fortune, not because she demanded it, but because she had earned it with kindness and humility. In her own heart, she felt lighter, knowing she was chosen not for what she had, but for who she was. The letter's final line stayed with her, reminding her that the greatest inheritance was not the gold, the land, or the titles, but the strength to carry forward the values that truly mattered. And so Margaret walked out into her new life, not as the forgotten cousin, but as the true heir of a legacy built on love, trust, and quiet strength.